Good afternoon, everybody. CEO, distinguished, honorable excellencies. In our part of the world, we say all protocol formalities are observed. Thank you very much. It is indeed an honor and a great pleasure to address this public event organized by the Atlantic Council in my capacity as the Prime Minister of the Transitional Government in Sudan. So thank you very much, leadership, staff of the Atlantic Council, for making this possible. I'm very delighted to be here. I would like to express our thanks and appreciation for the continuous support the American people in all their walks of life, administration, think tanks, institutions. Your support to the struggle of our people, what made us stand out and able to fight the dictatorship until we defeat it few months back. So thank you very much for that. In these few remarks, I would like to share with you a brief on the transitional period priorities, challenges, and some of our achievements so far. So let me start with that. I am sure, are you hearing, is the microphone working well? Sure? Because I could hear the echo. Thank you. I'm sure you have followed what happened in Sudan over the last months, but certainly over the year. This month, December last year, witnessed the beginning of what proudly as Sudanese, we call it our revolution, and proudly we compare it to great events that took place in the world in the recent history. We find it relevant and appropriate to compare it to the great French Revolution that changed the face of the world and brought us liberal democracy and all those. The changes that has taken place in Sudan are deeply rooted. It has engulfed the entire country. In Sudan, in the last 50 years, we had about 3 transitions. 1964, 1985. This time round is very different. It has engulfed the entire country. Impressive marches from as far as Al-Fashir in Darfur, the east, the center, the north, converging in Khartoum. Unified us, the entire nation. So we are proud to compare it to great revolutions in the world. I think Sudan will never be the same again. Things have changed forever. The most distinguishing factor in this revolution and the change is its peacefulness, but also it was led by young people and women. Our women were in the front line leading this revolution. Also, it has been very impressive, resilient movement. Every time we thought it's dying down, it surprised us with more vigor and more energy into it. Sustain itself for a long period of time. So let me now turn to the priorities of the transitional period. After a long and challenging process, we have established the structures of the transitional government, put in place Sovereign Council, Ministerial Council, but also established the leadership of the legal system, having put in place Chief Justice and Attorney General. I'll talk about that in a minute. The slogan of the revolution, freedom, peace, and justice, is what guided us in establishing these priorities. We identified about 10 of them for the transitional period, and I would like briefly to summarize them. Our number one and top priority is to stop the war and build the foundation of sustainable peace. Essentially, to stop the sufferings of our people in the IDP camps and the refugee camps. We think the opportune time of stopping this war is now. As you all know, the leadership and the armed groups played an important role in this change. And when we talk to them, we are not talking to the other, to the different, we're talking to our people, to ourselves. So there are no differences. We don't have any agenda, hidden or otherwise. That's why we think we could not achieve peace during this transitional period. It will be a distant dream. It wasn't by chance that my first visit outside Khartoum was to Juba, for two reasons mainly. One, the symbolism of this relationship between Sudan and South Sudan. We are one nation. History obliged us, maybe mistakes and all that, to stay in two states, but we are one nation. Our brothers and sisters in South Sudan voted overwhelmingly for independence, 98% of them. So South Sudan independence should not and cannot be compromised. But we can live together as two sisterly nations. We share the longest borders, over 2,000 kilometers. Let us together transform these borders from borders of conflict and misery to borders of peace, prosperity, and development. To honor the legacy of our late hero, John Garang, who called this Al-Tamazuj belt. And we can think about this belt from Darfur. It's a small town in our borders in Central Africa, to Al-Kurmuk in Ethiopia. Transform it to that prosperous border. We don't need to demarcate it. Can leave it as soft borders. And so through that process, we'll be able to address challenges of ABA and others. I think also visiting Juba gave us an opportunity to meet with the leadership of the armed groups, the Sudan Revolutionary Forces, SRF, and SPLM North. And we had a very fruitful, nice exchange on the issues, and I think it is only a matter of time before we should be able to reach an agreement on this. I also visited the IDP camps in Al-Fashir, 2 or 3 of them. But the most vivid memory I took with me from Zamzam camp, the IDP camp, not only the huge crowd that came to meet us, but it is the first time in the history of those camps that they have witnessed or seen somebody from the central government come to see them. It was a very moving moment. But the climax of it was the first speaker was a woman who took the floor and delivered the first speech. articulated so well their interest, what their expectations about the transitional government, how do they see the peace process. After that, she was followed by 6 speakers. None of them spoke for more than 2 minutes. They all said, our sister articulated our issues, and we are very satisfied with what she said. I think that gave us the assurances. Our people in the IDP camps, with all the sufferings and the miseries they went through, it taught them, educated them, and made them strong enough to be able to say, from now onwards, we know what is good for ourselves, and nobody can dictate on us anything. This is very liberating. Then we acted on a number of issues. We gave unfettered access, humanitarian access, to the affected areas, whether cross-line from the country or cross borders from anywhere in the world. Our second priority is addressing the economic crisis and reviving our national economy. You know so well, we inherited an economy that is, it's calling it bankrupt economy is the least characterization. Mounting debt in the tune of 60 billion US dollars, rocketing prices, hardships and all that. But we are very determined also, relying on our people, resolve and determination, and with the support of our partners, we'll be able to move on with that. Third, reforming the structure of state institutions. You know, when the British left the colonies, they left in Sudan probably one of the best civil service in the world. And it was like that, ticking like a clock. It has been destroyed. We need to rebuild it from scratch. Fourth, we strive to build solid foundations for the establishment of the rule of law, transparency, accountability, justice, and for that matter, transitional justice that is firmly linked to the peace process. We're not going to rest until and see that justice has been served on the accountability part of it to the best and the maximum satisfaction of the victims. Combating corruption and addressing issues of the recovery of stolen assets is key priority. Billions of dollars were lost during the last 30 years. We will not rest until we recover it back in the interest of our people. 6, we work towards fair and well-deserved women participation and representation in the structures of the transitional government. As I said earlier, our women were in the front line leading this revolution. And I can share with you, I think you know it very well, in the cabinet we have 4 women members of the cabinet. Wala here, the Minister of Sports and Youth. But also, we gave Sudan its first Foreign Affairs Minister. First Chief Justice is a woman. Very rare commodity in our region. In our Sovereign Council of 11 members, we have 2 women. One of them from our Coptic community. The symbolism of that, a very small Coptic community, but this is intended to address our diversity, our respect to it. Diversity, if managed well, can be a source of prosperity and strength. Seven, build balanced foreign policy based on mutual respect and non-interference, guided by the interests of Sudan. For 30 years, we had a foreign policy that has landed us all kind of ills in the world. You know them. 8, address youth unemployment and opportunities. And here, We would like to create an environment that would allow us to create an environment with give hope to our young generations, our talent. We don't want them to take this very dangerous journey across the Mediterranean. We want them to stay, because losing them, we are losing our future. So we have to create that environment which create quality jobs, create an environment of respect to human rights, good governance, that would allow this young talent to see future in the country. 9, address social issues and priorities of focusing our resources on health, education, human development. No nation in the world has developed without seriously addressing the issue of building human resources. And the final priority for the transitional period is to hold a constitutional conference, which would allow the entire nation an opportunity to address its problems of identity, of politics, and all that, and agree on a constitution. And then one of our major tasks to hold free and fair elections that will give the nation opportunity to choose freely their representative. These are briefly the priorities of the transitional period. I don't want to give an impression that everything is perfect, is well and good and all that. Far from that. Still have so many challenges, and just maybe I will briefly share with you some of these major challenges. One, the challenge of getting it right in the peace process. We have so many challenges here. Many armed groups, the danger of having parallel tracks of negotiations. There is also the challenge of having regional and international interest and interference in our affairs. But I think staying together, we'll be able to mount that. Second challenge is linked to the economy. The issue of subsidy, debt, and funding short-term requirement of the transition. Subsidy eats probably 30 to 40% of our budget. As I said, we have a mounting debt. All these are challenges of the transitional period. The challenge of building and reforming and restructuring state institutions, whether it is the security sector reform or public sector reform, these are all challenges we have to deal with. Of course, Ambassador Booth, as we've been saying over the last 2-3 days here in Washington, the elephant in the room is the issue of the delisting of Sudan from the state sponsoring terrorism. This issue has a lot of bearing on so many processes, not to mention the debt, investment, but also opening the country at large. So this is something, unless it is addressed, all these other processes will not take. Then lastly, the challenge of the political challenges of the transition. How to manage expectations. Our people have very high expectations about this change. So the ability to manage it. And here I think we take it on ourselves to be very open, frank, transparent with our people. We know that it's a legacy of 30 years. It cannot be resolved and addressed overnight. But we will be very open with that. And I think because we don't have any interest other than our people's interest, we should be able together to mount it. Then the challenge of inclusiveness and representation and all that. The challenge of establishing and creating a national project. I think for 30, 40, 50, 60 years, to be exact, 63 years, we failed, or let me be more positive, we did not succeed in creating a national project for our country. It's an opportunity now. Let us together work on creating that national project whereby we agree on how Sudan should be ruled and leave the issue of who should rule Sudan to the choices of our people. And then lastly, in these challenges, the challenge of holding the constitutional conference and the election and all that. But I think relying on our own history, we should be able to mount that easily. Let me just lastly, maybe briefly outline our expectations from our partners and friends. I think we'd like to see partners and friends supporting peace talks, political and technical support to the peace process, and finance post-conflict development. Work with us to mobilize development and humanitarian resources towards Sudan transitional priorities. Advocate and support the removal of Sudan from the list of states sponsoring terrorism, and to support the Sudanese economy through investment, economic partnerships, and anti-corruption effort. Also provide capacity development support for state institutions and all that. Sudan hope to achieve full cooperation with the international community and partners. I think what happened in Sudan, in that sea and a region full of crises and riddled with conflicts, Sudan provide hope. If we get it right in Sudan and work together, there is a success story that is emerging. So let us work together and make that a success. Thank you very much.
Some water. Well, Mr. Prime Minister, thank you for a very comprehensive, albeit perhaps a little high-level overview. We're going to kind of drill down on some of the issues that you touched on. I want to acknowledge the front row of our audience here because they're worthy of some special consideration. Ambassador Don Booth, Special Envoy for Sudan 2.0, with us again. Ambassador Tim Carney, who is going to lose the title, sadly for Tim, but happily for all of us, as the last United States Senate-confirmed ambassador to Sudan, and Atlantic Council International Advisory Board member Baha Hariri, founder of our Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East. Thank you all for being here for this important event. So there's not much excitement about your trip here, clearly, given the large attendance and raucous reception that you've received, and you've had a big week in Washington already. And so I want to talk a little bit about the historic nature of this visit and what it's achieved, but also, as you touched on earlier, how you manage the outsized expectations of your population, who are now kind of free from 30 years of autocratic rule. You see the kind of unbridled enthusiasm that has released, and your presence here represents for them. So first, how has Washington been thus far? How has the reception been? And when you've spoken to U.S. officials, what has been the roadmap that you have heard? And what can you tell to the rest of Washington and to your own citizens here about what we can expect in the future of the bilateral relationship during the transition period?
Thank you very much, Cameron. And as I said, I'm very delighted to be here. But I think I would like to start with the announcement by the Secretary of State on restoring relationship between our nation at the level of ambassadors. This could never have taken place in an opportune time. Thank you so much. This signals the beginning of a relationship, but drawing a line, so that this will provide, I think, huge opportunities in the cooperation between our two nations. We'll be very delighted to take it to further heights. So I think it was, if we go back with nothing but this, we would have achieved our mission here over the last few days. Mm-hmm. But having been here, in DC for the last 2, 3 days, first you would be observing and seeing the complexity of the institutions and the structures here, from administration to the Hill to the think tanks and all that. It has been an extremely important, useful visit for us. Afforded us the opportunity to exchange views, listen to our American friends and partners, know their concern. It gave us an opportunity also to put across our case and share with them what are our expectations. And I think this provided solid ground for an opportunity to have a roadmap that will take this journey together, addressing our challenges. I'm very satisfied with it.
Great. I want to address some of the skeptics who might be out there, and I know you've heard some of the skepticism. Partly this is because Washington has a 30-year history with Sudan that is not all good, and certainly doesn't reflect the inspirational remarks that you just made. We have a very pained history over the past 30 years, and it's going to take a great deal of effort to undo that and to recreate a new image of Sudan. And so while you're doing that, at the same time we continue to see certain reports of violations in Libya, or Sudanese involvement in the conflict in Yemen, or crackdowns in other parts of Sudan, which may be occurring. And so I think one of the questions that Washington has, being 7,000 miles away, is how do we square your remarks as the head of a civilian government that espouses all of the right priorities as you've laid them out, with a military government which is still largely in place. It feels a bit like a house divided, where you have civilians and military perhaps not always implementing the same policy priorities at the same time. And so how have you responded to skeptics in Washington about this forced marriage that you're in during the transitional period?
You know, we are very proud as Sudanese to call what we have been able to achieve in that region a Sudanese model of transition. I am absolutely sure when this story is written and studied well, it will be taught in universities and centers of excellence and think tanks. It's a model that is, we did not wait for a finished agreement and understanding on everything, and then we roll it to implement it. We are thinking on our feet. With all the challenges, we decided we will do it. If you look at our transitional government structures, we managed to establish 2: Sovereign Council at the Cabinet. We are yet to establish the Legislative Council. We didn't wait like other places in the world for an agreement that will be polished in Oslo, in Rome, in London, or further down in Washington. It was homegrown. It's all the challenges. But we are very determined as Sudanese to make it work. That model brought together, it's a compromise. So there is no actually time lost to begin to call it is civilian or it is military. It came about because of the understanding and the agreement between the two sides. So essentially it's a compromise, historical compromise that allow us to stop the bloodshed and define new dispensation and dawn for our country. We know it's far from perfect, but we know so well we should be able to make it work. And I think this is what is lost to the rest of the world. You need to understand that. The idea of expecting a finished product that will land on us from the sky and then we implement it is far, far, far from the reality. So we need people like you, Cameron and others and friends to understand this reality and help us, because you see the danger of not working on it now, if Sudan is allowed, we are here. If it's allowed to slip from this, it will not go back to the former regime. It will go to a failed state. It will be Yemen, it will be Libya, it will be Syria, it will be all those. We are giving the world a new hope, a new ways of addressing problems of our region. Nobody sitting anywhere in the world can claim they understand our reality better than us. As Sudanese working on it, we are happy to address it. And I can assure you, with all the problems in the minds of people, this partnership is working.
Okay, so I'm going to pin you down on that and explore that question a little bit. I'm glad you said that.
Very happy.
I'm glad you said that. Because again, in Washington, they look at not just the institutions, but they look at the individuals. And there are individuals, and there, well, it might be the wrong premise, but nonetheless, people look not just at the institutions, but at the individuals who occupy those institutions. And the government, broadly speaking, still has individuals who are of great concern, who are, as Washington would view them, malign actors, who you are again sort of forced into a relationship with inside the leadership of the country. And so, first of all, how has the relationship been with military generals like General Burhan or militia leaders like Hemeti, who have, I mean, it is fair to say there is great concern still in Washington, especially with respect to delisting Sudan from the state sponsor of terrorism list when they look at the leadership structure of the country and see people who may one day end up going to the ICC or be held accountable in domestic courts for crimes committed against the Sudanese people. I think there's it's hard to square that circle, and I'm wondering how you do it.
Can we be candid here?
It's just us.
Yes. The Atlantic Council started years back advocating for the delisting of Sudan.
Yes.
I don't know, did that happen in a democratic environment? It wasn't. So let us understand and appreciate the situation then was far worse than anything you could describe today. We're not saying it's perfect, but we're saying it's a step in the right direction. Let us help it. Work with us together. The risk of not acting is far much outweigh anything that acting on it.
Okay. So take me inside then. So you're not answering my question about the relationship. So I'm gonna give you an example.
Okay.
So there was some local press reports in the last few weeks regarding the debate inside the government about removing the public order law, which was very well received, and the dismantling of the NCP, which I think was a historic achievement and signaled a real departure, real break from the previous regime. Take us inside the meeting between the cabinet and the Supreme Council, where it was reported that this conversation, this debate went on for many hours. What is the level of resistance, acceptance of this very ambitious reform program that you have proposed? Because I think that is the question that Washington is trying to.
I'm very glad you mentioned that, and we have here 4 of our ministers who were there in the meeting. Okay? It took 5 minutes to agree on the repealing of the Public Order Act. Nobody rejected it. I was sitting in the meeting. I hear this fake news. I'm sure here in America you know this term. Talking about I resigned.
I heard that.
When we were in the meeting, cordially discussing this, not only that, they said tanks are surrounding the palace and a coup is in making and all that. Nothing of this sort actually happened. You know what prolonged that meeting? People didn't know that it was 2 meetings actually. We had the joint session, and at the same time we had the meeting of the Higher Peace Council. So we talked the first the Public Order Act was approved in 5 minutes. There was no even discussion on that. But the second one, which is the dismantling of the deep state, if you could call it that, it was a long piece of legislation about what? How many pages? 8 pages or? 8 pages, yeah. So you can imagine 8 pages discussed page by page, and there were amendments. Some are genuine, some are not, and all that. And then the Minister of Justice would go out to work on them and come back. In between, we switch to the meeting of this of the the Peace High Council, which has different also membership, and then we'll go back to the other. So it was parallel meeting being conducted almost up to 12 midnight. That what made it. Actually, it was the determination of that sitting for us to approve that law on that night. We could have adjourned and say and ask the minister, please go and make these changes in your computer and bring it next week. But we said no. We have to approve this tonight. And that is what made it went so long. There's nothing. There was no serious agreement on this. I'm surprised people are making things. I can just give the Minister of Justice is here. Maybe Nasruddin, you can share your reflection on this.
So maybe I can even come here. Okay, thank you very much. I am very happy to be here. Before I speak about that night, I would like just to say that our relationship with our counterparts in the Sovereign Council is very good, and we are working as one team, whether from the civilian part or from the military part. This is a very necessary partnership, and it will be an example, as the Prime Minister mentioned, of how to actually have a successful transitional period. With regard to the adoption of the dismantling of the former regime act, we actually submitted the act to them, and they received it actually the same day. And we gave them like 2 hours just to read the act, because we were very keen to pass it that night. And I told the 2 councils that this law has been actually approved by the streets. People are waiting outside and they are expecting us to act. The members of the Sovereign Council, including the military members of the Sovereign Council, said actually we have been waiting for this law to come to us for a long time. And we are very happy that it is here, but we need some more time to read it. We had a 2-hour break. They went and they came back with very constructive comments and suggestions. So I am very glad to report that we had differences, but they were very constructive differences, and they only helped us improve the law and have a very good version of the law. So that was my experience, and thank you very much.
So let me carry on in this line and perhaps move to a different example, because one of the priorities you mentioned multiple times in your remarks was the peace process. And again, from Washington, I think people are trying to discern where the leadership is on the peace process and what you think the prospects are for making peace with the armed movements in the near future. We have seen, frankly, military leaders more in the front of leading those talks in Juba, and maybe we're not seeing the role of the civilian government in those talks. But I'd like you to expand on your comments about the peace process and how you're sort of dividing the labor, as it were, between the military and your own colleagues on the civilian side of the House.
No, thank you very much. This is a very good, excellent question. Actually, the peace architecture which we are looking at, you see there were number of visits to Juba. General Hemeti went there twice. They gave us Juba Declaration and a few others. I went there myself, and many others of our colleagues. The way we are looking at it, because in the past, peace negotiations were very much dominated by elite thinking. An agreement in Doha, agreement in Nivasha, agreement in Abuja, in Addis, in all these places. This time round, we would like to address the root causes of the conflict. And that is why we agreed that the approach to peace will be driven by 4 pillars, 4 thematic areas. Number 1, on economic and social development. And this will go into issues of uneven development, issues of marginalization, social services, and all that. Essentially going into the root causes of development. If you look at the IDP camps, the refugee camps, these are not problems. These are symptoms of a deeper problem that drove those people away from their places. The second theme is on the legal aspect of the peace process, which is addressing issues of justice, compensation, and legal structures of peace. The third area is on governance and political issues, addressing issues of governance, identity issues, and all that. And the fourth one, which is on the security arrangement, which is essentially addressing DDR, mobilization, but more than that, providing an opportunity for our people who are carrying arms to be incorporated in the national army, create a new army, so to speak, an army that every Sudanese will see themselves in it, truly representative of the country. These are the 4 pillars of the peace. Each one of them is headed by a minister. Our Minister of Justice is heading the legal one. The economic and social development is headed by the Minister of Finance and Economic Planning, and the Minister of Federal Government heading the political governance, and then the Minister of Defense heading the security arrangement. So the idea that the peace process is dominated by the military because General Hemeti and 2 other generals went with him into Juba, it's a very deceptive idea. The 4 pillars are headed by ministers, but also technical peoples in it. The Freedom and Change will be part of this, the FFC. So it is, as I said, it's a partnership. People only see small part of it by this. The entire military members of the government in both sides are 5 people out of 30 or 32. So I think let's I am one person who always experience taught us to see the glass as half full and being optimistic to pull this country together. If we lock ourselves in misery and always looking at the negative side of things, we'll never get anywhere. We know there are imperfections everywhere, but we with this positive thinking and positive energy, we will be able to take our country somewhere else. So that's how we see peace.
Okay. I want to ask specifically about Darfur, because you're in Washington, which was in many ways the birthplace of the Save Darfur movement, this advocacy campaign, which seized this city for some time and brought to international attention the conflict in Darfur. But the other reason I want to bring it up is because the legacy of Darfur, I believe, weighs heavily on the bilateral relationship still. And I know that the peace process with Darfur is bundled with all of the other peace processes with armed movements around the country, but there are very specific pieces of legislation in the United States that the Congress has passed and that through executive order previous presidents have passed. And in fact, I was recently reminded that there are 30 American states which have individual sanctions on Sudan for actions related to the conflict in Darfur. And in some combination, there are a number of requirements across the federal, the congressional, and the state level, which seek to, as you have suggested, create a credible and comprehensive peace with the people of Darfur, which you've elaborated on already. But secondly, calling for the disbandment or the integration of the militias responsible for carrying out those crimes. The third is a measure of justice and accountability for the people of Darfur who experience these crimes. And lastly is the safe return of the more than 1 million people who remain displaced. Now, you've touched on a lot of these, but what I haven't heard a lot about yet is the disbandment or reintegration of the militia forces that committed these crimes. And I'm curious, given the outsized role, at least in the popular perception, the outsized role that the RSF played over the summer, the course of the revolution, and certainly played in a previous incarnation in Darfur. What is the conversation like? What is the thinking like right now about broadly security sector reform and the future of that particular militia, given that there are specific pieces of legislation in this country that would prohibit the ultimate lifting of sanctions if that issue was not addressed?
You know, the struggle of our people in Darfur, whether inside the country or outside the country, and the campaign here in the States and elsewhere in the world, created that momentum which helped our people inside the country to topple the dictatorship. So the struggle here, the Darfur movement, Enough, Save Darfur, and all these efforts over the years, which helped us to reach where we are now. And I think we are very appreciative. We owe it to that effort. And the campaign of all people, of all walks of life, helped the Sudanese people to reach the situation, and it is highly appreciated. And there is no way we would have reached the current status without that support we enjoyed. I think moving forward, we will have to be able to restructure, reform our security sector. It is key. I said earlier, the one pillar of the peace is the security arrangement, which will look into the DDR and all that. But the most important part of it, we would like as Sudanese to create a new army with new culture, with new tradition, and with new orientation. An army that is truly national, like our orientation in the constitution and all that. Religion, ethnicity, and all these things does not unify us. What unifies us is citizenship. And we want to create an army that is built on those foundations. And I think if we failed on that, then we failed Darfur people. Yeah. And I think what we would be doing, this would have to be guided, and I said it earlier, by the aspirations and the interest of the victims in the IDP camps and in the refugee camps. They will guide us. And
do you have a plan for soliciting their input or engaging in a more structured way with them?
Absolutely. What I didn't say in link to the pillars, we are designing a process that will go to all these camps and the refugees, solicit their views. Not only that, but also take their representatives to go to Juba and be part of the negotiations. So we're not going to go and have an elite pact somewhere and then come back with a finished product. They will be part of it, and they will have to be consulted on it.
I would be remiss if I did not bring up, as you called it, the elephant in the room.
I leave that to you.
But I want to ask a different question about the terrorism issue, which is, we talk a lot about the debt that Sudan has, the external debt, the arrears, but there is not an insignificant debt to the victims of the past regime's terrorist acts. And there are, in fact, multiple judgments in the United States that the government of Sudan has, like the other debts, inherited. And I believe this will be an important aspect of removing the state sponsor of terrorism going forward. I recall, and I'm sure you have been recalled, that when this was lifted on Libya, one of the stipulations made was that the Libyan regime make restitution to the victims of the Lockerbie air attack. And so I'm wondering, have you begun to contemplate how you might settle these lawsuits, or had conversations about resolving that so that that impediment is not in the way of moving forward with a swift removal of the terrorism designation?
You know, I must say that the discussion we had over the last few months and weeks on the American side, led by Excellency Ambassador Booth and ourselves and many others, we've progressed in this file very well. There was a long list of requirement conditions came even from the former regime. And I think we were able together to tick a number of them. The humanitarian access, religious freedom, tolerance, human rights issues, all those we were okay with them. Even the issue of the terrorism. We are Sudanese as a people, we've never supported terrorism or any of that sort. It was the former regime that supported this. So we are getting into a better understanding on this file every time we are talking together. When it comes to the claims, you know, we are also as a nation victims of terrorism that inflicted on us by the former regime. But we accepted this as a corporate responsibility. And we are negotiating. We have a team actually here in New York from our side, negotiating with our counterparts from the State Department very well. And I think we are making progress in this. And we hope we will be able to reach a conclusion on that. We took full responsibility as corporate responsibility. Yeah.
So it's fair to say you're optimistic that this is moving in the right direction?
I think so.
Okay.
It is. At least this is something we agree on.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I have a list of questions from the audience, and I'm going to use the moderator's prerogative to amend and edit a few of them for length. But there is one here that I want to ask about, which is it's a provocative question about the reunification of Sudan, and if that could ever be a potential. But I want to add to that, given your new role as chairman of IGAD, not that you don't have enough on your plate already, but you have to now fix the region and not just your country. How do you see yourself playing a role, especially given the importance of South Sudan, as you mentioned in your remarks? So this feeds into the question of, do you ever anticipate, or could you ever envision a reunification? But more importantly, now that you have this chairmanship of IGAD, how can you use your good offices to assist your brothers in South Sudan traverse a very, very difficult time in their very young history?
You know, as Africans, 1963, our founding fathers established the Organization of African Unity. And Nkrumah, the great leader of Ghana, said, the independence of Ghana has no meaning if the rest of the continent is under colonial rule. Our dream as Africans to unify the whole continent under one flag, one currency and all that. We didn't achieve this. So the idea of unifying North and South, it will continue to be a dream. Okay? We might achieve it one day, but at least for today, let us live together as good neighbors. There is a lot we can do together with these borders. Let's leave them as soft borders and all that. But I think the South is helping us by hosting our peace talks. We should be able to reciprocate that and host their peace talks in our country. Actually, the discussion I had with President Salva Kiir, I told him, take a leaflet from our book. Don't wait for a finished agreement. Start somewhere, and we can help each other to get somewhere. Former regime might have been inciting, might have played the trade-offs on all this, but now we don't have any other interest other than the interest of our people on both sides. Let's work together to address this. Of course, IGAD give us a more added actually input, and you are right, that we will be able to help them addressing the challenges of their peace agreement, but working together, I guess there is a dawn of change in the entire region, particularly the northern part of IGAD, and we should be able to fix this.
Another question from our audience is about Sudan's role in Yemen, and I would expand it to perhaps include other conflicts in the region. We cited Libya as another example. The question is, how much are you aware of the military or the militia's role in these conflicts, and is there anything that you hope or can do to curtail Sudan's perhaps malign regional actions?
You know, when it comes to Yemen and many other places, this is a legacy we inherited. I think the conflict in Yemen has no military solution, whether from us or from anywhere in the world. It has to be resolved through political means. We will help our brothers and sisters in Yemen and play our role with the rest to help them address this. The soldiers, the Sudanese soldiers in Yemen, there are not many. I think the minister is here. Probably with the last group that came back.
15 to 5.
Yes.
It's 5.
Yes. So it's going down.
5,000.
Yeah, it's about 5,000. But these are some of the legacies we inherited from the previous regime, and I think, as I said, there is no military solution there, and we should be able to address that in the near future. But I think the bottom line is we should be able to help in a political solution for the Yemen crisis.
So you would anticipate being able to return Sudanese troops from the war in Yemen?
Absolutely.
Okay. I think this is the time for our last question. We're coming up on our stop time. And there's a question from the audience about capturing the assets of the previous regime and the fact that this is perhaps a very dangerous exercise, given that there are entrenched interests in the country who are still associated with that regime. How do you go about reclaiming stolen assets? How do you go about reclaiming the assets that are still under the control of powerful forces, the military, and others?
There are two types of assets here. The assets that are inside the country. The law that was enacted a week ago will allow us. Actually, let us be frank here, we are not confiscating. There is no issue of confiscation. We are simply taking back what was belonged to the Sudanese people. And the law allowed whoever has a point or an issue with that to appeal. Convince the legal process that you earn this, whether it's a building or money in bank or any property, that you earn this legally and rightfully. We'll give it back to you. But all what we are doing, there's no nationalization here. It's just taking back assets that is belong to the Sudanese people and return to its rightful place. That is inside the country. Of course, the major battle will be recovering the assets outside the country, whether it's property or money stacked in banks and all that. The good news, I think the fight against terrorism did not leave room for hiding money. I'm very glad to recognize the presence of my brother and friend Raymond Baker, whom we worked together on under the leadership of President Thabo Mbeki on the issue of illicit finance from Africa. I think relying on that experience, we should be able to trace the money that was stolen from the country and bring it back. There are so many instruments that could be used. The stolen asset, the STAR initiative from the World Bank and from the UN and ADB would help us access this. And I guess there are so many experiences around the world in our region, we can rely on it to help us bring that resources back. The Nigerians and many others use this. And I think we will be able to address this. It might take a while, but we are confident this is resources of the Sudanese people. We need it to build the country and plow this money back in development, services, and all that.
Well, Mr. Minister, I cannot think of a more ambitious agenda. I was scribbling down all of your priorities. 3 years does not seem like a long time to achieve what you have set out to achieve for your country and for your people. But I know that you have the enthusiastic support of certainly everyone here in this room, and in Washington. I think you've made many new friends for Sudan on your visit here this week. So I thank you for your time tonight, and I wish you Godspeed and good luck in your endeavors forward.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Let us work together. There is a success story in making. Let us work together and make it reality. Thank you so much.
That's the headline.
Thank you.
Thank you.